When my husband told me that he trusted me to help his boss, I felt a mix of emotions. The weight of his words lingered with me long after he had said them. This wasn't just a simple request. It was an act of trust, of belief that I could handle something delicate. My husband had always been the kind of person who believed in me, supported me when I needed it most, and encouraged me to go beyond my limits. But now, he was putting me in a position that, to him, required both discretion and responsibility. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. I was about to step into a role that was important to him, and that felt significant. I wasn't exactly sure what his boss needed from me, but I knew one thing. This wasn't just about helping out a superior. This was about maintaining a connection that could affect my husband's career. His boss was someone he had always admired, someone whose opinion carried weight in their industry. To be trusted with such an important task, to be in a position to assist him, meant that I was expected to handle things with the utmost professionalism. It wasn't just an opportunity, it was a responsibility. I had to be careful with my actions, careful with my words, and always maintain the respect that my husband's career and reputation deserved. At first, I thought of it as a minor task, something I could manage with ease. My husband had explained it in simple terms. His boss needed some help with a personal matter, something he didn't feel comfortable asking anyone else to handle. And I, being his wife, was the natural choice. I figured it would be one of those things where I'd assist briefly and then go back to my regular routine. Maybe run a few errands, help organize something, or even just act as a sounding board. Nothing that could ever complicate my relationship with my husband. After all, I had no reason to think otherwise. The excitement of being trusted with such an important task filled me with a sense of purpose. It was a rare opportunity. I was stepping into a space that few other people had access to, my husband's professional life, a world I had always seen from the outside. I couldn't help but feel proud that he had seen something in me that made him confident enough to place me in this position. It was a testament to the bond we shared, to the mutual respect that underpinned our relationship. He trusted me to represent him, to support him, and to contribute to the image he was working so hard to maintain. But with that excitement came a sense of pressure I hadn't anticipated. As much as my husband trusted me, I understood that this wasn't just a simple favor. This was about managing expectations, maintaining professionalism, and, perhaps most importantly, preserving trust. I didn't want to do anything that could jeopardize the faith he had placed in me. I knew that this wasn't just a task. It was a reflection of his trust in me as a partner, someone capable of managing delicate situations with grace and responsibility. In a way, I felt as though I had been given a test, a way of proving to both myself and to him that I could handle the responsibility he had placed on me. Still, the task itself seemed so straightforward at first. I didn't think much about the potential for complications or unforeseen outcomes. I figured that once the job was done, everything would return to normal. I'd have completed something for my husband, and his boss would be grateful, perhaps even impressed. But as I arrived at the office, ready to begin, I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation, this simple request, was more complicated than I'd initially realized. I didn't know it then, but this moment, this simple request for help, would be the beginning of something far more difficult to navigate than I could ever have imagined. What started as an innocent act of trust, something I believed I could manage without issue, would quickly become something I would regret. It would test my boundaries, challenge my morals, and force me to face the consequences of my decisions. But for now, all I could do was accept the responsibility and hope that I was prepared for whatever was to come. The trust my husband had in me, the way he believed I could handle this task without question or hesitation, meant everything. It was a vote of confidence that felt like a badge of honor. And with that came the pressure to not let him down. The task, at first, seemed harmless enough. My husband had explained that his boss, Mr. Harris, needed help with something personal, something he didn't want to share with anyone else in his office. He had always been the kind of person who took on every responsibility himself, and when he asked for my assistance, it was clear he was struggling with something serious. I wasn't sure what the nature of the task was, but I trusted my husband's judgment. After all, this was someone he respected deeply, someone who had played a major role in his career advancement. I never thought much about what could go wrong. The first few exchanges with Mr. Harris were cordial. He was professional, and I tried my best to mirror that professionalism. He mentioned that he needed help organizing some personal documents and thought it would be easier if I did it for him since he didn't want anyone else to know about the matter. It wasn't anything overtly unusual, but I could feel the weight of his request. He had placed me in a delicate position, one that required tact and discretion. His words felt carefully chosen, as though he wanted to ensure I understood just how important this was. I agreed, eager to help. As we began to spend more time together, the dynamic subtly shifted. Mr. Harris had a certain charm about him that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just that he was confident or intelligent, but he had a way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room. He listened intently when I spoke, offering thoughtful responses that made me feel valued. He knew exactly how to engage in conversation, always steering it in a way that made me feel seen, heard, and appreciated. I started to realize that it wasn't just his leadership that commanded attention, but his ability to connect on a personal level. At first, I dismissed the little things, the way he would compliment me on my dress or how he'd notice the smallest details, like how I styled my hair that day. He was, after all, a man in a position of power. He had the confidence that often comes with that power, and I didn't think much about the subtle flattery. But then the compliments began to shift from neutral to personal. They weren't just about my appearance anymore, they were about me as a person. He'd tell me how intelligent he thought I was, how my ideas were always so well thought out. His praise started to feel less like a professional acknowledgement and more like an attempt to build rapport on a deeper, more personal level. I felt conflicted. A part of me was flattered. He was a man who was used to getting what he wanted, and he clearly had a way of making people feel important. But something inside me knew that this wasn't appropriate. I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that it was just his nature. I had always prided myself on being strong and independent, and I didn't want to make something out of nothing. He wasn't crossing any major lines, yet, but there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something that tugged at my gut. The more time I spent with him, the more I couldn't ignore the subtle hints of inappropriate behavior. One afternoon, after we'd spent several hours working through some paperwork together, Mr. Harris casually leaned back in his chair, fixing me with a gaze that seemed different than usual. His compliments felt less professional, more personal. "You know, you're much more than just a good assistant," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have so much potential. I think you could really go places if you ever decided to explore more opportunities, maybe even with someone like me showing you the ropes." I didn't know how to respond. The words hung in the air, thick with implication. He had always been kind, always a gentleman, at least that's what I had told myself. But in that moment, I realized I wasn't entirely sure anymore. The line between professionalism and something else was blurring. I had no idea where this was heading, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. I tried to keep my composure, to maintain a professional distance, but a part of me was drawn in. His presence was magnetic. He was so easy to talk to, so charismatic, and it made me feel more at ease than I should have. I found myself laughing at jokes that I would have otherwise brushed off, nodding along to things I normally would have questioned. But that was when I realized this wasn't just about the task anymore, it was about something else entirely. I felt like I was being pulled into a web, one that I didn't want to get tangled in but couldn't seem to escape. Every compliment, every moment of attention made me question my own boundaries. I knew what was right, and I knew what I had to do to protect my marriage. But there was an undeniable part of me that wanted to keep things smooth, to avoid confrontation, to avoid making things awkward. That's when I started to recognize that I wasn't just handling a simple favor for my husband. This had become far more complex, and my growing discomfort was a sign that I was in too deep. In those moments, I was torn. My loyalty to my husband, my commitment to our relationship, made me feel like I had to pull back. But at the same time, Mr. Harris's influence was overwhelming, and the subtle manipulations he employed made it hard to even recognize that something was wrong. The small red flags that had been there all along began to turn into glaring warnings. But I couldn't yet see the full picture. I didn't know just how much I was about to regret this moment. The moment everything shifted didn't happen all at once. It was subtle at first, like a shift in the air that you don't notice until it's already there. I had been spending more and more time helping Mr. Harris, feeling that it was just part of my duty to my husband's work, never fully considering where it could lead. The compliments, the casual touches, the lingering gazes, little things that I had brushed off, began to build up until they couldn't be ignored anymore. It all started with something small, something that in hindsight felt entirely innocent. One afternoon, we had worked late into the evening, sorting through some papers. I was exhausted, and so was he. There was a moment when we both took a short break, sitting down in the office with a drink in hand. Mr. Harris smiled at me, and for a brief moment, his hand brushed against mine. It was accidental, or at least that's what I told myself. He immediately pulled his hand back and apologized, but there was something in his eyes that told me it wasn't as accidental as he wanted me to believe. I laughed it off, thinking I was just overthinking the situation. Maybe he was just tired too, but as we continued to work, it happened again. This time, more deliberately. His hand lingered a bit longer on mine as he passed me a file. The touch wasn't innocent, and I knew it. There was a part of me that wanted to pull my hand away, to distance myself and remind him of the boundaries that should never be crossed. But I didn't. I hesitated for a split second, and in that hesitation, I made the mistake of letting it slide. The guilt hit me almost immediately, but I brushed it off. It's nothing, I told myself. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something inside me felt unsettled, like I was standing too close to a line I shouldn't be crossing. I was still trying to convince myself that it was just a misunderstanding, that maybe I had overreacted in my mind. But the truth was undeniable. I had let the situation become something it wasn't supposed to be. Over the next few days, I found myself constantly questioning my actions. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I had allowed myself to get too close to him, too comfortable in his presence. It wasn't just the physical moments that lingered in my mind, but the conversations as well. Mr. Harris began to share personal things with me, things I wasn't supposed to know. He spoke about his marriage, his struggles at work, and even his frustrations with his own life. He spoke with such raw honesty that I felt like I was the only one he trusted, and that, in itself, made me feel important. But the more he opened up, the more I felt conflicted. I didn't know how to handle it. A part of me felt drawn to his vulnerability, to the emotional intimacy that he was offering. But another part of me knew I had crossed a boundary, that something I couldn't take back had already happened. I had allowed myself to become emotionally entangled in a situation I should have never let develop. And with each passing day, the weight of that realization grew heavier. The confusion I felt was overwhelming. I had always believed that I was strong enough to handle situations like this, that I could remain professional and focused. But now, the lines were blurred, and I couldn't tell where my responsibility to my husband ended and where my own feelings began. I began to feel like I was betraying him, even though nothing physical had occurred. The emotional connection with Mr. Harris felt wrong, and I knew I had allowed myself to become too invested. The most difficult part was the guilt. The feeling that I had let someone manipulate my emotions, even if unintentionally, was unbearable. Every time Mr. Harris smiled at me or made a comment that seemed just a little too personal, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. I knew that I had allowed it to go on for too long, and I couldn't undo what had already been set in motion. The moment we crossed that invisible line, there was no going back. And I couldn't stop thinking about how one small mistake, one moment of hesitation, could lead to a disaster I wasn't prepared for. That's when I realized how big the mistake really was. It wasn't just a moment of weakness or a brief lapse in judgment. It was a mistake that could have devastating consequences. I had allowed myself to get too close to someone I should never have let in. The guilt ate away at me, and I wondered if it was too late to fix things. Could I distance myself now without making things worse? Had I already let things go too far to turn back? I wasn't sure how to face my husband after everything that had happened. The lies I had told myself, telling myself that it was harmless, that I hadn't done anything wrong, felt like they were crumbling down around me. What would he think if he found out? Would he be able to forgive me? Or had I already broken the trust that had been built over the years? It wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about me, too. I had let my own desires, my own confusion, cloud my judgment. And now I was left with the mess of my actions, unsure of how to clean up the wreckage I had caused. I felt trapped, overwhelmed by the consequences of what I had allowed to unfold, and unsure of what the future held. The day everything came crashing down is one I will never forget. The weight of my actions had already been weighing on me, but I couldn't deny it any longer. What I had done had serious consequences, and I had to face them. When my husband first found out, it wasn't through anything I did or said. It came to light when Mr. Harris, my husband's boss, started acting strange, distant even. He stopped being as cordial with me as he used to be, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. Then, one evening, after another day of feeling like I was walking on eggshells around Mr. Harris, my husband finally confronted me. It wasn't planned. The conversation just happened. I could feel the tension between us all day, but I didn't know how to address it. I thought maybe if I ignored the issue, it would just go away. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. My husband looked at me that night with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Hurt, confusion, maybe even a hint of betrayal. He started with a simple question, his voice steady but strained. "Is there something going on between you and Mr. Harris?" At first, I froze. I wanted to deny it, to say nothing was happening, that he was misunderstanding everything. But I knew that lying was no longer an option. The guilt was already eating away at me, and pretending it was all fine would only make everything worse. Still, the words felt like they were stuck in my throat. How could I explain something that I wasn't even fully able to understand myself? I finally admitted what had happened. I told him everything. The moments I should have avoided, the times I let Mr. Harris get too close, the confusion I felt, and the guilt I had been carrying with me for days. But no matter how much I explained, no matter how much I tried to make him understand, it wasn't enough. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the hurt in his eyes, and it cut deeper than I ever expected. His trust in me, which had been unshakable, was now shattered. There was no way to repair it in that moment. I tried to apologize, tried to tell him how deeply sorry I was, but the words felt hollow. I knew I had hurt him beyond repair. His response was quiet, but the sadness in his voice was undeniable. "I trusted you. I trusted you with everything. And you—" He paused, his words caught in his throat. "You betrayed me." I felt the weight of every single word. I couldn't deny it. I had betrayed him. I had crossed a line that I could never take back. The guilt that had been building up inside me for so long now spilled out, overwhelming me. It wasn't just about my mistake with Mr. Harris. It was about the trust I had broken with the one person who had always stood by me, the one person who had believed in me without question. The conversation went on for hours, but no matter how much I apologized or explained, I could see the damage was done. The emotional toll it took on both of us was immeasurable. He was angry, yes, but more than that, he was hurt, and I was crushed under the weight of knowing that I had caused that hurt. The person I loved, the person I had promised to be loyal to, was now questioning everything about me, about us. I could see the cracks starting to form in our marriage, and it terrified me. Everything that had once felt solid, safe, and secure was now slipping through my fingers. I tried to convince myself that we could fix this, that we could rebuild the trust we had lost, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Trust, once broken, isn't easy to repair, and I had already done the damage. For days after the conversation, I tried to act like everything was okay. I tried to be normal, to pretend like nothing had changed, but nothing was the same anymore. Every time I looked at my husband, I saw the pain in his eyes. He wasn't the same person anymore. The carefree laughter we once shared was replaced with tension, and the closeness we had felt seemed like a distant memory. I wanted to fix everything. I wanted to take back the moment I allowed Mr. Harris to cross the line to undo everything that had happened, but I couldn't. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. The self-recrimination was overwhelming. How could I have been so careless? How could I have let myself get so caught up in a moment of weakness that I sacrificed my integrity and my marriage? I kept telling myself that I hadn't meant for it to happen, that it wasn't supposed to go this far, but deep down, I knew it was no one's fault but my own. I had let myself make excuses, telling myself that it was nothing, that I could control it. But I couldn't. I had let my emotions take over, and now the fallout was something I had to face head on. In the end, there was no easy fix. The damage was done, and while I wanted to believe that we could work through it, the reality was that things would never be the same. The trust had been broken, and I wasn't sure if it could ever be fully rebuilt. The weight of my mistake lingered, a constant reminder of the consequences of crossing a line I should never have approached. The aftermath of the mistake felt heavier than I could have imagined. No matter how much I wanted to go back in time, I knew that the damage had been done. It wasn't just the act itself that hurt him. It was the betrayal of trust. When the dust settled, I realized that rebuilding what we once had would take more than just apologies or promises. It would take consistent effort, reflection, and maybe even time. In the days that followed, I was consumed by regret. I understood that words alone couldn't undo what had happened. I tried to show my remorse in every possible way. I was more present, more attentive. I put effort into being there for him in ways that had been absent before. Yet it was clear that no amount of gestures would make him forget. Trust had been shattered. He didn't want just words. He needed proof that this was truly a mistake, that it would never happen again. And in some ways, I couldn't blame him. I spent hours reflecting on how I had allowed myself to get to that point. What was it that made me forget the values I had once stood by? How could I justify the actions that led me to this place? Slowly, I began to realize that it wasn't just about one moment of weakness, but a series of choices I had made leading up to it. I had ignored boundaries, rationalized my behavior, and allowed myself to fall into a pattern of complacency that eventually brought me to the brink of making a decision I would regret forever. I tried to communicate with him, hoping that being open and honest would help. I shared how much guilt I carried, how deeply sorry I was for what I had done. But even as I spoke, I could see that the words fell flat. They weren't enough. The emotional walls he had put up were too high for me to climb, and no matter how many times I told him how much I regretted it, it didn't feel like it was enough. In my heart, I knew I had to do more. I couldn't just ask for forgiveness and expect everything to go back to normal. I had to prove that I was genuinely committed to rebuilding the trust that I had broken. That meant being consistent in my actions, even when it felt like nothing was changing. I became more transparent, more willing to listen, and more aware of the needs he had that I had neglected. I made a promise to myself that I would never again allow myself to fall into a situation where I could be tempted to compromise the values I held dear. But as I worked toward showing him my remorse, I also had to confront the fact that there was no easy way to repair the damage. The path wasn't linear. Some days were better than others. There were moments where I thought we might be able to heal, and then there were times when the silence between us was deafening. I knew that trust wasn't something that could be instantly restored. It had to be earned back piece by piece. The emotional scars, while they might fade over time, would always be there as a reminder of what I had done. Over time, I began to notice small changes. He was less distant, though still guarded. He would engage with me, but there was always a careful hesitancy in his words, in his actions. I took that as a sign that, While things weren't perfect, they were moving in the right direction. But then there were moments when I saw a flicker of anger or hurt in his eyes. It made me wonder if I would ever fully earn back his trust, or if this mistake would always linger in our relationship. The hardest part of all this wasn't just the guilt I felt, but the realization that the past couldn't be erased. There was no magic fix. The trust that I had taken for granted was gone, and in some ways, it was never coming back. I had to live with the consequences of my actions every day, and while I hoped for healing, I had to accept that some wounds leave scars. Could things ever go back to the way they were before? Or had I permanently altered the course of our relationship? Despite all the effort, there were days when I wasn't sure if it was enough. Was I doing enough to show him that I had learned from my mistake? Was I giving him the space he needed, or was I pushing too hard? It felt like I was walking a fine line, constantly trying to find the right balance between giving him time and space to heal, while also showing him how deeply sorry I was. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I could repair what had been broken, or if the damage was irreparable. The hardest question of all, the one that still haunts me, is whether a relationship can truly recover from such a mistake. Can trust, once broken, ever be fully restored? Or is the scar of betrayal too deep to ever heal completely? The road to redemption, I've learned, is not a straight one. There are no guarantees. I may never fully be able to undo the hurt I caused, and maybe that's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life. But what I do know is that I've learned. I've learned the importance of trust, of boundaries, and of never taking someone's love and loyalty for granted. Whether we can repair our relationship fully is something that only time will tell. But I have to believe that we can, even if it's not the same as it was before. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that mistakes don't have to define us forever. But how we learn from them and grow is what truly matters in the end.